everybody. This is Patrice, as you know. I am so excited about the trauma series that we have to bring to you today. So I want to welcome all of you as a group or anyone who's joining us individually. Welcome, welcome, welcome to us. Our series this is the first of a series of 6 in the series of trauma review, and there'll be a lot of different other titles that we'll be going through, but we're excited to have Mara and Liz with us to talk through this topic and give you the opportunities when we pause to ruminate over what we've discussed and maybe come up with some other ideas yourself. But first, I want to give us a chance to be able to introduce ourselves. As you all know, and some of you may not if you're joining individually or you're new to the company, my name is Patrice Goings-Boyd. And just to give you a little bit about myself, I've been working with families as a home daycare provider and other areas for the last over 30 years. I did home daycare for 7 years in my home, so I've worked with kids and families. I've had the opportunity to start a program myself called Help, I'm Going to Be a Mommy with my husband. It was a resource and referral program that we had people come in to where we were at, and we provide services for pregnant moms. So the bulk of my work has been with teens and pregnant moms and children. So I've also started, been a co-starter or co-founder for a charter school called Kairos Academy for pregnant girls. So I've done that work, and I've worked in residential facility, and currently, as you know, I've been 16 years with DDI Vantage. In the last probably 3 of those years, I've been a coach for you all, family advocates, helping you and supporting you in the work that you do at your home. And a fun fact about me, Lala is right next to me. So if she starts barking and acting crazy, if you see me giving the evil eye, you know, this is my furry child that we have to have one of those, hands-on Holy Ghost experiences are on the way. So if I have to put my camera off, you know what's happening. Anyway, you guys know me and how I talk. So let me turn you over to Liz and then Mara to tell you who they are.
Thank you, Patrice. Patrice is hard to follow because she is just an amazing woman and does amazing work and has just an amazing resume behind her. So for those of you who do know her, you know how lucky we are to have her. So I'm Elizabeth Garcia. I go by Liz. And I am new to DDI. I was just brought on under Patrice's mentorship as the second coach. So I'm working hand in hand with Patrice and getting sucked into her world of all these things we do. And we're really, really excited about these podcast series, and in particular, this trauma series that we get to do with Mara. So we are excited to start this and get this out there to you guys. I have my bachelor's of science in psychology from Westminster College. I minored in gender studies. I have a year done of my counseling PhD program. And a lot of my background, a lot of my work is very centered in trauma. My published research is within sexual trauma, especially sexual trauma experienced by women. Or those identifying as somewhere within a female spectrum. Further, that's a lot of my working background as well. So I've done a lot of residential care, a lot of adolescent girls, high acuity behavioral and trauma experiences for those kiddos. So lots of very heavy things. That's what I'm very passionate about. So I'm excited to be stepping into these series and stepping into the coaching position to really help FAs and help collectively DDI look at trauma and look at the families we see from a whole new lens. And a fun fact about me is I love Lala, and Lala can talk to me any day. I also have my set of furry babies brought to you via COVID-19 and Zoom Life. One is Milo, and I have to say his name quietly or else you'll hear him darting across floors because he's convinced that our new way of life featuring Zoom was made just for him. And all y'all just show up to be friends with him. And each time my laptop opens, it's really just a chance for him to like sit on my lap and stare at someone. Griswold is my extremely large cat, and he just has an attitude. So every now and again, he'll just see the dog existing. So you may hear a swat and a hiss, or he may walk over and decide that as his human, I owe him pets. So a lot of this series and a lot of these podcasts have some very fascinating co-hosts that we'll call them. So you can definitely expect that from Patrice and I, but Mara has her set up together and is ready to not have furry babies crashing a show.
Yeah, I have no fun facts for babies around here, but I support them making guest appearances for sure. So I'm Mara Haight, and I use the pronouns she, her, hers. I am a licensed mental health counselor, therapist. That's just my licensing, but I'm a practicing therapist and the founder of the Utah Center for Post-Traumatic Growth. I have worked in the field of trauma before I even would have identified it as the field of trauma. For the past 15 years, I've been working in domestic violence and sexual assault work. I started at like 18 years old as a victim advocate, working at a police department and going into people's homes after domestic violence incidents or all kinds of traumatic things, homicides or suicides, and just being there to support people in their moment of crisis. And then from there, decided to abandon a potential career in law because I saw how nuanced and difficult this work is, and that the criminal justice system wasn't handling it in a very restorative way for families. And so I've worked for South Valley Services. I've worked for the Rape Recovery Center for many years. I've also worked for the Veterans Administration, and I'm just really passionate about creating trauma-informed communities. So I'm really excited to be doing this work with EDIB and really see you all as doing that restorative work, really meeting people where they're at and wanting to bring a more holistic approach to how we serve people who are going through difficulties. So I'm really happy to be here and to be embarking on this series with you both. And I don't know that I have, I feel like I sort of shut down when someone's supposed to say a fun fact. I do love to just like dance around my house like a crazy person. So I feel like that is probably the fun fact about me. There's no fur babies here, but I kind of sub in for a fur baby with my level of hyperactivity when I'm not working.
Okay, thank you, Mara. Thank you, Liz, for that. So now let's talk about the goals and why, the whys of why we've done this podcast. I think we're all very passionate about the work that we do and continuing on the work that we do. One thing that I have heard all of us talk about is that, going to some of these trainings are like, we hear it, we listen to it, and then it's over with. We don't make application to what we have heard and seen to the work that we're doing. And I'm very excited about what we're going to be presenting to you. That's what we want to do. So we want to continue on with the trainings that we get all the time through the webinars, through the conferences, through just all of that learning that we get. We want to just not have it stop there, but we want to continue it and be able to apply it to all parts of our lives and the work that we do, but the work that we do with our families. We want this to be a tool for new hires so that they can come in and have a broader picture of the work that they will be doing eventually. And for those who are just kind of coming in and maybe looking at it and seeing if this is really what they want, but also for those who have made that commitment, yes, this is what I want to do. then they have that training, and they can use this training to go back to and refer back to. And then teaching those working with families how to recognize trauma. Sometimes it's hard to see. Sometimes you don't know it. Sometimes you've been in it for so long. This is just life. You don't see that you've been living in a traumatic situation and it's impacting you. So we want you to be able to recognize it, help your families to recognize it. We want you to be able to name it and say, yes, this is what I'm feeling. And then heal from the trauma, which is all of this that we're getting. Where we want to get to is healing. We want you to be able to heal from all of this. And then we want to be able to teach professionals, all of you who are the professionals going in the home, to have a deeper and more introspective conversation about your own baggage. We love this work, and we're in this work because we love it and we want to help people. But we want to also be able to recognize the impact of the work we do and how that impacts us and how that impacts who we are and the work that we are able to do. We don't want you to leave. We want you to stay doing the work that you love, and you got in this for a reason, but we need you to be able to recognize it and to heal from it yourself so that you can go further and do the work that you loved. So with that, I also want to say that we will have pauses built in to this podcast. And we want you to be able to take the time with your group or individually to ruminate, think over, talk to, and talk about the concepts, the ideas that come up for you in this. We'll give you a guide with questions on it to help start the conversation. But I'm sure there'll be a lot of things that come up for you that you can just bring up yourself. So with that, we want you to be able to really get and take home all of what we plan to give you. So at this point, I have more to give you. With this, we have, I think, a binder we'll provide you with. We'll provide you with all of the handouts, with the guiding questions, and all of those things for you to be able to refer back to, and then follow along really with Mara as she goes through her talk. So with that, let me pass this on to Liz.
Thank you, Patrice. So like Patrice mentioned, there's certain objectives that we want to make sure you as an audience are really able to take back to your work from this series. So the series as a whole, we are hoping, and we feel that we've designed it in a way that you should be able to see the families you work with, and maybe even yourself, in these conversations and in the case study we've created and are going to present to you. Specifically for podcast one, this one, our trauma review, some of the learning goals that we anticipate is you're going to be able to really access an empathetic response to the case study family that we're going to present you with, to the situation that we're going to present an FA in within the case study, etc. So we also want you to be able to learn the foundations of trauma in this series, but more than just learn them, like Patrice is saying, we want there to be that continuation of knowledge to the point where you're applying the things that you're going to hear us talk about in this series, where you're applying some of the conversations you're going to have in your own small groups, or if you're watching this as an individual, in your own reflection. So really, we want to see you use this to create behavior changes, to create application, more than just a deeper understanding. So from there, keeping that in mind, I want to start to introduce you to the family and the case study that we're going to be using throughout this series. Before doing so, however, we do want to kind of set the disclaimer that this is not a real family. It may have been inspired or pieces taken from some real cases in our day-to-day work, but in no means is this the same names, the same demographics, the same pieces of any one story that may have really happened. So we've really taken the time to design a family and to design a case study with a lot of intricacies for this series. Likewise, while we protected some of the confidentiality within certain factual stories that we may have pulled from, we would like to welcome you as an audience, if you are working within a group, to kind of keep that same confidentiality between yourselves. This may lead to conversations that are very vulnerable, where someone shares something that they may not want taken outside of the group or the context in which they shared it. So please just keep that in mind as you guys are doing some of your own work with this training series. Additionally, before I get into the nuances of our family, I do want to put out a trigger warning. We will be talking about multiple forms of oppression that can bring up a lot of people's own triggers. Specifically within this first series, I will be detailing an incident of self-harm that also can be a strong trigger for people. And we will be talking about various levels of abuse and violence throughout this series. We do welcome you to stop watching and participating whenever you need to. If you, for yourself, you need to stop, you need to take a break, maybe you don't even come back to this particular podcast. Maybe you try again with podcast 2 in this series, or maybe you just step away and you need to reach out to someone to kind of process what came up for you. That's fine. Please do whatever you need to support your own safety, your own comfort, and your own access to learning. If you reach a point where you've completely shut down, please know it's okay to then step away from the podcast. And also in your groups, please, if you have the emotional resources to do so, support the people around you, support the people who may be feeling more triggered than you or having a different reaction than you. But again, do that emotional labor as you can support it for yourself, and just take care of yourself. So for this series, we are going to be looking at this case study family in terms of an FA showing up to a home visit and a particular situation happening at this one home visit. So I want to take some time to introduce our characters. In your resources, you do have the full explanation of each one of our family members, so I'm only going to touch on them briefly. The only one that we will review in full is going to be our kiddo, the youngest kiddo, who's actually enrolled with the FA in this case study. So we'll start with mom. Her name is Agnes. She's in her 40s. She's Irish German American. The FA describes her as presenting as a parent who needs a significant amount of emotional support at their visits. She is very distrusting of not necessarily the FA, but systems that interfere with families in a larger sense. That being said, the FA does report that she is more willing to share about her own trauma than the kids. So there's only certain ways that the FA is really getting holistic information about the family from mom. Additionally, mom has been very forthcoming about her relationship with her current boyfriend, whom the family lives with, and that a lot of that relationship for her is based around economic need. And she does struggle with how that interplays with his role in the kid's life. So that boyfriend, his name is Gregory. He's also in his 40s. We don't know a whole lot about him. He is just mom's boyfriend. He describes himself as a stepdad figure. He does come to the visits. He is respectful, and when it needs to just be one-on-one with mom or one-on-one with the kiddo, the FA doesn't report him seeming to have any issue with that. He's interested in being there for the kids. Other than that, we don't know a whole lot about him. Jared Sims is one of the bio dads in this family. He is the bio dad for the 2 youngest boys. So there is 3 boys and 1 girl. So the 2 youngest are both boys, and he's their bio dad. He's a Black male, and he identifies as Christian, according to mom. And he also has 5 other children who are not in the picture and that he did not have with Agnes. Agnes has shared a lot about him with us, and primarily shared with us that she feels he misuses the kids in their relationship. She says when he does come around, it's more just a hi bye to the kids, and that's about it. That he uses the kids to stay in her life and continue some emotional and mental abuse that's become part of their cycle prior to their divorce and then continuing through. Jared is very physically violent, especially with other male figures around Agnes. So he started a physical altercation with Gregory. And then additionally, there was some kind of hysteria in that situation because Jeremiah, one of his sons, was very hysterical and crying and begging mom not to call the police. It seems that the oldest son, who is not biologically Jared's, broke up the fight. He was bruised and harmed by breaking up that fight. And then so shortly after that incident, the second time mom was contacted by DCFS happened. So this is contributing to some of the mistrust that the family presents with. The next bio dad is Jorge. We don't know much about him. He's not in the picture at all. Mom says that because of Jorge, that is the first time she was ever involved with DCFS. She said she was contacted by DCFS shortly after moving into an emergency domestic violence shelter. And Jorge is the father of the two oldest. So at the time that they lived in the shelter, mom only had the two oldest kids. So Quinn and Candace. So the oldest boy and then the girl. She really hasn't shared much about the impact Jorge has had on the kids. And the only thing descriptively that she shared with us in the FA is she stated he is a typical Latino. Next is Myrtle. She's the maternal grandma. We do know that Myrtle's very involved with childcare with mom. It seems that she has a lot of strong relationships with the kids and with mom. Mom says sometimes she's frustrated by how grandma steps into disciplining the kids, but overall, this is a very supportive relationship, and it's very helpful and comforting to the entire family. Next, we're going to move on to the kids. So we have Quinn. He is our oldest child. He is 16. We don't know much about him. He doesn't really participate in any of the visits, and he keeps to himself. The FA has noticed some LGBTQIA plus merchandise around, so on his wrist and then some pins on his backpack. But that's really the most we know about Quinn. Candace is who's going to be next on your handout. We're going to come back to her. She has a lot to do with the scenario the FA walked into that I'm going to present at the end of these characters. Jeremiah is the second to youngest son. He struggles with concentration in class. Mom has let us know that he has been formally diagnosed with ADHD, and he does take medication for it. He does have some issues with eating, what he will eat, and eating with the family. Mom does report that she loses her temper with him a lot more than the other kids, but she really attributes that to how much time she does spend with him. So mom's very forthcoming about Jeremiah needing a lot of one-on-one attention and care from her. And she does report doing a lot of back and forth between his school and his pediatrician to really support his development and where he's at right now. Anthony is our 2-year-old. He's 2 years and 4 months. He is our kiddo enrolled with the FA. And he is the youngest kiddo in this family. So he is very engaged in the visits with the FA. The FA reports that he can focus very well one-on-one with her. And that really when he starts to lose or struggle with some of that focus is when mom or Gregory try to take over the role from the FA and kind of be the primary one engaged. Anthony is still completely nonverbal, but his pediatrician has ruled out this being because he's neurodivergent. And for those who don't know, basically what neurodivergent means is anyone who has maybe like a learning disability or some sort of biological factor that is limiting the way that they're able to develop. So in Anthony's case, the pediatrician has ruled this out and feels that this is maybe more of a emotional delay rather than a biological or physical delay. Mom reports she's never heard him say a full word. He can't follow mom's finger from side to side. However, if you point at a picture in a book, you can watch him kind of follow where your finger's going. So he can follow two pictures, not mom's finger side to side. He doesn't show any delays in his gross motor skills. And mom reports he's not picky when it comes to food. And he doesn't have any sleep disturbances and does fine sleeping through the night. So Candace is the only kiddo we haven't talked about. We don't know a lot about Candace other than the situation that the FA walked into. So the FA went to a home visit that was scheduled and previously agreed upon as normal. She was led into the house by one of the kids. Upon entering, she heard a lot of commotion, a lot of screaming. From the kitchen, she could hear Candace screaming that she wanted to kill herself. She could then hear the adults involved, so mom, Gregory, the boyfriend, and Myrtle, grandma, screaming back at her. It was just a very escalated situation. She got closer to the kitchen, at which she noticed that Candace had a piece of broken glass. She's not sure where it came from, but a piece of broken glass, and was actively self-harming with it. She had open cuts on her wrists, and as mom or boyfriend was moving closer to her, she would jump back and she would scream that she didn't want to be touched. The FA does not report that it looked like mom or boyfriend was necessarily trying to abuse Candace, but more restrain her, take the glass, grab her, physically make her stop the behavior. All of the three other kids were present during this encounter, but there were no additional friends of the family or anyone else in the household at the time. So this is what the FA walked into. So now that we've kind of covered our family, the situation that we're looking at this family in, some of the basics for the podcast and the series as a whole, we want to invite you to take your first pause. So if you look at your discussion resource, it's going to break down for you kind of that first pause and some things that we thought might be helpful for you to talk about, think about, or some questions you should address. But of course, feel free to talk about what's coming up for you and what seems most important to discuss at this point. And then after you're done with your pause, take as long as you need, and we'll be here when you come back. But we're going to keep going. So since we've covered some of these foundations, we want to welcome Mara to start diving into key terms and concepts that are really important when conceptualizing this family.
Thank you, Liz, for that overview of the family. There's obviously a lot of dynamics happening here, a lot to take in. So I'd encourage people to read over the case study on their own and really take a moment in that to just process what's happening and what's coming up for you as you consider each member of the family. I'm going to use this family to talk about just some of the basics of trauma. So our goal today is more of a trauma 101. And throughout the series, we're really going to talk about how do we apply this? What are some of the skills we might use with this family? What does trauma-informed care look like? So today we're just going to really focus on understanding the terms and some of the basics of trauma through the lens of this family. You have a handout that you can follow as a guide. The handout just says trauma overview on the top, and I'll put it up on the screen in just a moment. But before I jump into that handout, I want to just talk about a couple overarching terms that you may have already heard us use as Patrice and Liz were talking, and make sure that we're all on the same page about what those terms mean. I'm going to talk about trauma a lot, but I want us to get out of the idea that the word trauma refers to a certain set of experiences, right? Often we've been trained to think, okay, trauma is going to war. Trauma is experiencing a sexual assault, right? That we think there's sort of this list of qualifying events that we can understand as traumatic. And I really want us to step back and recognize that trauma is actually a neurobiological response. It's anything that triggers our fight-flight response or a freeze response. And it's more useful to think about it as a common experience that we all have, right? That trauma is a part of life. Things will make us feel unsafe, and we're going to go into that response. So as we talk about trauma, I want us to not think about it in such a limited way, but understand that this is something we all go through, and it's a common experience. Same thing with the word triggers. This is one of those words I have some people I work with who are like, I'm so tired of that word. It's overused. It's become meaningless. And I actually think it's a really lovely term because it describes exactly what happens when something makes us feel unsafe in some way, either physically or emotionally. We get triggered. What that means is that our nervous system, something in the environment, triggers our nervous system into a stress response, into a survival response. And without any sort of decision making on our part, we go into a fight, flight, freeze, friend, fawn response. We're going to talk more about what all that means. Some of that might be familiar to all of you already. But when we say trigger, that's what we're talking about. All of a sudden, the part of our brain that's job is to keep us safe comes online. We have this full neurobiological response, and we no longer can think clearly because we're just focused on survival, right? You may find yourself triggered throughout this conversation. There may be parts I noticed as Liz was speaking and started talking about the scene and talking about the glass. All of a sudden, my mind started to wander to a client that I had, a house that I had gone to where someone had self-harmed, and I'm very triggered by blood. And so I started to notice myself losing track of what Liz was saying. My heart started to beat a little bit faster. I was getting a little bit lost in that memory. I was triggered, right? That's going to happen to all of us. It's normal. And we want to make sure that we all understand what we mean by that. And also part of this series is going to be figuring out how do we work with that? What do we do to get ourselves back into a more regulated state? So that's another one of the terms I'm going to use. Often use the term dysregulated or regulated. And sometimes when you're doing a certain line of work, you start to think of these terms as terms everyone uses, right? So I was out to lunch with another therapist and my partner, and I'm using the term, and my partner, after almost 2 years with me, said, "Can you say what you mean by when you say regulated?" Oh, yeah, okay. I had no idea this whole time. You had no idea what I was talking about and just didn't want to ask. So when I'm saying regulated or dysregulated, I'm really talking about our nervous system, right? Is our nervous system in a state of steady, safe, normal regulation, right? My heart's not beating too fast. My palms aren't sweaty. I feel pretty peaceful and calm in my body. I'm well regulated, right? If I'm dysregulated, everything's out of whack, right? We all know what it feels like to get dysregulated. I started to get dysregulated when I got triggered, right? And why I like these terms is it really normalizes that this is a full body nervous system response, right? So when we're dysregulated, everything goes out of whack with the goal of keeping us safe, right? So my heart rate speeds up. I start to get agitated because neurochemicals are filling my body to help me respond to a threat to my safety, right? And that's going to cause all kinds of feelings of internal dysregulation that also show up in our behavior. So those are some important terms. We're also going to throw out the term vicarious trauma. That's not on your handout. We talk about vicarious trauma. We also sometimes use the term secondary trauma, talking about the trauma of witnessing, right? Either through direct witnessing, that FA walking into the house and witnessing that scene, that's vicarious trauma. But even, Patrice or Liz as coaches, if that FA were to come in and tell them that story, that is that vicarious trauma as well, right? Because our brain has to process this really horrific thing that's being told to us, and that can trigger that same survival response. So when we talk about vicarious trauma or secondary trauma, that's what we're talking about. It wasn't something directly experienced by me, but I still had a trauma response to it because I had to take in and process the information. We also, as we went over this case, you may have noticed that this this family has a lot of different identity components that are things that we want to consider throughout the series. We're going to use the term intersectionality quite a bit to understand the context of trauma, the context of people's lived experience. So the term intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is an attorney and professor who started to recognize that the conversations we were having about race and gender and sexual orientation and class and all these different identities that we all hold were really siloed. We're not helping us understand how our different identities come together to inform our experience. So we really want to make it a priority throughout this series to bring an intersectional lens to the work, to recognize how different types of trauma, different types of oppression, different pieces of identity, different historical pieces within the family and within the community are impacting what's traumatic and how that is experienced by the family, right? So those are some terms that we want you to keep in mind. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now, and I'm just going to bring up that handout that you all have access to so that you can follow along as we talk about how trauma is showing up with this family. So I mentioned this before. Many of you have heard me speak before and probably have a sense of how we're defining trauma, but I want us to really think about how it's showing up here for this family. So obviously we're having we're walking into a traumatic experience, right? So as we look at the types of trauma, this whole theme that Liz described is acute trauma, right? This is a significant threat to, for sure, the survival of Candace, right? So Candace is feeling like she is self-harming and expressing that she wants to die. So that is clearly a significant threat to her survival, and also a dramatic challenge to that whole family's sense of their family system in the world, right? We're not safe. Everyone sort of is moving into that fight, flight, freeze response. And each family member is probably having a different response, right? So we know that Mom and so Agnes and Gregory are both really actively involved. They're in that fight, flight response, like they're approaching her and they're trying to intervene and do something. So we can think about that as they're moving, they're really being pumped full of these action neurochemicals that help them try to fix the situation in some way. Now, we don't know what's happening with the other people in the scene, but we can imagine that some of them might be kind of frozen, right? Especially some of the kiddos who are there in the house that don't really feel like they have a whole lot of power to do anything in the situation. They're trying to process what is even happening, right? They're going into a trauma-based response as well, but they might be freezing. So we're going to talk more about the different ways that trauma responses can show up in just a minute. But this scene would be a really good example of acute trauma. Now, there's also a lot of chronic trauma happening for this family, right? So chronic trauma are these daily occurrences that challenge or alter our sense of safety or belonging in the world. So that can be just having the experience of going to school and, people knowing that your family, the police have come to your home, right? So let's say that advocate has to call the police because this scary scene is happening. And now all the neighbors see the police come. And now all those kiddos have to go to school every day with people who know this happened. And now they're starting to feel like they don't belong, or they're different, or they're strange, or they might be interacting with people and getting that kind of feedback because of this information. So chronic trauma is just this way of constantly feeling like you don't belong, or that you're wrong or bad in some way. One type of chronic trauma is insidious trauma. So this is those daily experiences for people who experience marginalization on a society-wide level, right? So thinking about this family, all of the children would identify as biracial. So they're very likely consistently experiencing insidious trauma within their community. They're, seeing things on the news about police killing people of color, and specifically Black people, and trying to process that information as they look at their siblings or themselves or their parents. And now bringing that into any situation they're in, a feeling of, am I safe in the world, right? You can see how all of these things are a threat to feeling safe in the world or feeling like you belong and can be emotionally safe, right? And they're all showing up with the family. We also have something called developmental trauma. This is how we describe trauma that happens while the brain is still developing. So if you think about these kiddos, all of them very likely have developmental trauma. We hear that have lots of violence throughout the development of each of the children. And so they all have been exposed to some level of trauma while their brain is still developing. And we're going to have a whole podcast talking about specifically developmental and attachment trauma, because there are some very specific things that happen to the stress response system and to the brain when we experience trauma during our development. One type of developmental trauma is attachment trauma. You kiddos have that as well. When we experience some kind of threat from our primary caregiver, that is classified as attachment trauma. Now, it's not always on purpose, right? So if we think about, the two bio fathers who we've identified have some history of domestic violence with Agnes, the kids were witnessing that. The parents might say, oh, we never harmed our children, right? We would never put a hand on our children. But as the kids are witnessing the people in their lives who are meant to be a source of safety and connection, and they're witnessing their potential for violence, or they're witnessing them as unsafe people, that really creates a lot of dysregulation for them, right? Because the place I'm supposed to look to for safety and to orient myself in the world and know that I'm okay is also a place where I experience some terror or fear, right? So we can imagine that there's attachment trauma happening with all the kiddos, and there's probably some attachment trauma for the parents as well, because very often attachment trauma becomes intergenerational, because when we haven't had safe attachment bonding with our parents, we often don't know how to do that with our children. And then we have this term complex trauma that really refers to some combination of all of these things, right? And this is very common. Many people, especially when you've experienced early trauma, developmental trauma, attachment trauma, then will experience more threats to their safety as they move through the world, right? Some of that is because these experiences feel normal, right? Some of that is because there may be some vulnerability factors that already exist, like we see for this family. So complex trauma really just talks about when we have this repeated exposure to trauma and how that cumulatively affects us in a different way than experiencing a one-time traumatic event would, right? So as we come back to that theme, if that FA coming into the home has had a really safe upbringing, has always felt like they have access to all the resources that they need. Let's say they have a good best friend that they can call up after that incident and just say, oh my gosh, I'm really overwhelmed. I just had this experience at work. They can go talk to Patrice or Liz and debrief the situation in detail. They may experience this acute trauma, but not have the same impact as many other members of the family, even though they were there in the same scene, because it may not be a complex trauma response for them. They don't have this history of trauma exposure. The context that they're experiencing this acute trauma in is different, and therefore their responses are different. So it's important to understand the different types of trauma, because we often, when we see trauma as sort of a list of events and we don't understand that there are some really important nuances, we can start to compare, why does one person cope so well and someone else doesn't, right? So I often will work a lot with sexual trauma, and sometimes my clients will say, I just don't know why I can't be more like Elizabeth Smart. She really seems like she has it all together, and she's experienced such awful things, way worse things than I have, but she seems like she's okay, right? Well, first of all, we don't know who's okay and who's not based off what we see in the media. But what we do know is that when you're believed, and when you have a whole community out there trying to protect you, when you feel like when you come out of a traumatic incident, you feel very supported by your environment and you have all of the money and resources to come back into safety and have time to heal, your outcomes are going to be a lot better, right? So when we understand that all of these different types of trauma are interacting for this family, then we can start to understand how complex healing is going to look for this family, right? We'll pause for just a minute and welcome. If there's anything you want to add for Patrice or Liz, I'm happy to have you jump in and say anything that's coming up for you, anything I might have missed.
Well, as for me, Mara, I just want to thank you because you brought up a lot of heavy things. And I think that that's going to be, the family advocates are really going to need the time to really sit through that and think through that. But before we even get into it, I feel like, having this look at the family and looking at this holistically, and it makes it easier to really see these concepts that you've talked about it, and then drop that into the families that we work with and really apply it, which is what we want to do, is to be able to apply what you're giving to us to the families that we're working with. And I think also it helps us to also recognize when we're assigned a family, that enrolled child is not just the only person we're working with. And that child is not just impacted by that she's little life that they're going through. They're impacted by everything, which for me brings up our circle of security when we're looking at that circle of life that child is walking through. It's not just their circle, it's the circles all around them that come into impacting their life. So you really captured that with the story, Liz, of the family, but also with what you were saying. So I'd say at this point, pause, think through this, and see how this is impacting you as we go through and now digest that family and break them up and look at what you've been talking about with us with this family.
Yeah. So I think we can just kind of like pause for a second and notice our own responses and what just any reactivity that might have come up or any ways that we might have been triggered as I was talking through the different types of trauma. Sometimes as we start to contextualize trauma in this way, we realize, oh my gosh, I've experienced that, right? And that can feel a little flooding, or that can feel kind of scary to contextualize yourself as, oh, maybe I'm a trauma survivor. So if that's coming up for you, just recognize that, notice how that's feeling. I want to talk a little bit about the trauma response that comes up for us. So some of you already understand this concept or have heard me talk about this concept of the window of tolerance, but I want us to think through our own responses in this way. So I've said a few times that trauma is anything that triggers our natural survival responses. But not everyone's survival responses are the same. There are lots of commonalities, but our level of exposure to trauma in our history, our sense of safety in the world, our sense of self-efficacy, or our ability to find safety is going to impact what happens to us when we're exposed to something traumatic. So all of us have what I'm going to call a window of tolerance. And this is based off of something called polyvagal theory. Really a metaphor. The window of tolerance is a metaphor for helping us understand dysregulation and regulation, right? Those terms that I already talked about. So a certain level of stress or stimulation from our environment can be tolerated by all of us, right? So my partner could come home tonight and say, be irritable, right? Just be irritable. And I might be able to really tolerate that and be fine and be like, oh, I'm going to give him space and I'm going to go out on the porch and drink my cocktail and I'm fine, right? I don't feel any level of dysregulation. If I grew up in a home where when my dad came home and he was irritable, right? If I grew up like Jeremiah grew up and I'd seen a lot of violence and I had to become really attuned to other people, right? Because of that attachment trauma. I might really be triggered by my partner coming home and seeing me irritable. I might immediately move out of my window of tolerance, right, and into these survival responses because my brain is taking in that irritability as something bad is going to happen, right? So when we think about the window of tolerance, we think about we're constantly taking in information from our environment and especially from other humans and constantly trying to figure out, am I safe? Am I not safe? The primary job of our brain is to keep us safe, right? Process information, keep us safe, make sure that we don't somehow get eaten by a lion or, whatever threats might be in our environment. So when our brain takes in information that it believes is unsafe, it moves us out of that regulated state and starts to prepare us to try to find safety or survival in some way. And there are two primary responses that happen. We either move out of that window and into a hyper-aroused state. This is when we start to feel really anxious and activated, and we go into that fight-flight, right? This is an automatic response of our autonomic nervous system. It's called the sympathetic nervous system response. And this no longer feels safe. My partner is, irritable. And I know in my past, that means that I'm going to get attacked in some way. And so I get really defensive. And I might say, what's your problem? Right. And if I do that, I'm up here preparing to protect myself through fight. Right. Or maybe I'm like, I got to get out. I'm leaving. I can't deal with this. I'm going into flight. Right. I believe I can fix the situation. So I'm getting out. Right. So we think about Agnes and Gregory, they see what's happening. They're clearly out of their window. They're clearly moving into, how do I fix this situation? I've got to get this glass away from Candace. I've got to, get us back into some sense of safety. And so they're moving into more of a fight response. Others in the house might have ran out of the room because they're like, I can't handle this. I got to get away, right? That's the fight response. So when we believe that we have the skills or tools or power to fix the situation, we're more likely to go into this hyper-aroused fight-flight. When we recognize that we don't have the skills or tools, either internally or externally, to do anything about something, we go into hypo-arousal. This is where we might see more of a freeze response, or what's also called a fawn response. Our nervous system actually shuts down to conserve energy, right? So we go into what can look like a really calm state, but we're numbing and we're dissociating, right? We're not really in our body. We're not really in our experience. It's actually a really handy thing that our mind does and our body does to keep us safe. And the kiddos in this situation, for Jeremiah and for Anthony and for Quinn, they don't have a whole lot of power, and they don't really understand self-harm and suicide well enough to be able to respond. So it would make a lot of sense for them to go into hypoarousal. So this is where a lot of times we see kiddos who've been really traumatized and they seem really, quote unquote, well behaved, right? They're calm. They seem like they're handling things really well. Sometimes they even get that validation, like, wow, you did such a good job. You didn't panic. You were fine. But internally, they aren't, right? They're disconnecting because they're so overwhelmed and they don't feel like they can do anything about it. Now, as we grow up, if we experience a lot of trauma in childhood where we're powerless, we're more likely to go into hypoarousal, right? So as an adult, we may experience something overwhelming, and even though we may have some power to change it, and we know that cognitively, as soon as we get triggered, we revert back to old ways of coping, and we might freeze, or we might shut down or start to dissociate because that's just what we know has worked in the past in a similar situation, right? So coming back to the example of my partner, if I had been in a really abusive household, I might shut down every time my partner gets irritable, and my partner might be really confused by that, right? Like he had a bad day at work and he comes home and I totally shut down, right? Because I can feel his energy is scary for me, and I don't believe I can do anything about it. I don't believe I can protect myself, right? So I want us, as we're working through this series, to really think about our own windows of tolerance. When we feel we can tolerate things, we feel safe and regulated in our bodies. Our heart rate is normal. We're feeling like we can experience emotion without disconnecting from it. And when we move out of that window and into these more survival-based responses. There is lots of information here on this handout about post-traumatic stress disorder. And I'm not going to go through all of it in detail. I'm not going to read through each piece, but I do encourage you all to do that. But one of the things I really want to highlight is that while we all experience things that push us out of our window of tolerance, that's a universal thing. All of us will experience that. And those are considered traumatic experiences, right? That's common. Post-traumatic stress disorder is not. So less than 10% of the population fits the criteria in the United States for PTSD. There are many factors that are going to determine whether or not we have that long-term impact of trauma, we have PTSD, or we don't. And as I look at this family, and it's clear to me that probably every member of the family would fit the criteria for PTSD, right? They've had enough trauma exposure, and the way that they're functioning as a family has a lot of indications of dysregulation, right? They're probably many of them experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. We can start, as we look at the risk and protective factors for PTSD, we can start to understand why that would be. Because the more trauma we experience, the more complex our trauma experience is, the more likely we are to develop those long-term impacts, right? So if you look at this little cycle on the screen, that salmon-colored square there, prior exposure to trauma and stress before some kind of acute trauma experience is going to increase our likelihood of developing PTSD. So we come back into the scene. The FA may very well not get PTSD from this experience. They might, right? If that FA had a parent who tried to commit or complete suicide when they were a child, or if they have had their own issues with self-harm, they may really develop PTSD from that experience, or it may aggravate or trigger a prior diagnosis of PTSD. But they might come in, experience it, have what we would call an acute stress response. That's what everyone has when we go into that sort of outside of our window. And they may pretty quickly come back into a state of regulation and not get stuck there because they don't have prior exposure to trauma and stress to such a degree that it would be a risk factor for PTSD. Then we experience something traumatic, and then what happens after this scene, what happens after for each member of this family and for that FA is going to be really important in understanding why some of them may develop PTSD and some of them will not, right? So our ability to access social support, connection, validation is key in whether or not we will develop PTSD or not. So this is why the job of a FA is so critical, right? Because you can be that social support. You can be that social support for each member of that family so they can process the experience. You don't have to be a therapist to help someone talk through and process what happened and validate, wow, that was really scary. That was really overwhelming. It makes sense that you shut down because you know, this whole window of tolerance thing, this is what happens. This is normal. You help them make sense of it, help them process the experience. And that can reduce the likelihood that there's a long-term impact or that we see development of a post-PTSD diagnosis. We also look at your resources, right? And I like to talk about resources through the lens of internal and external. So what resources do I have internally? Do I feel like I have personal permission to advocate for myself based off my experience in the world? Do I have a personal experience of power in the world? Do I have actual access to power and resources outside of me, like a safe place to live, access to funds to go to therapy? Do I have food on the table so that I feel safe enough that I don't have to sort of stay in this hyper aroused state as I'm trying to function and just get the day-to-day going? Do I have good coping skills that I learned in a safe environment from safe parents? So all of those internal and external resources are going to impact whether or not we develop PTSD. And so this is why we see people go through what seems like the same experience and have very different reactions. So I want you to think about that as you think through this family and how each of them has access to resources, access to power, all of their past experiences, all of their support networks, and how that may impact how they move forward, and why some of the kiddos may fare pretty well, some may not. Some of the parents may adapt and get back to normal more quickly, and it really helps us to understand and empathize with that. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing this and bounce it back over to you two, because I know that we want to take a pause. I'm going to bounce it over to Patrice, and we can take that pause, and then we can dive into our own reaction.
Okay, let's take a pause for as long as you need, and we'll continue. So you can come back when you're finished going through all of these concepts. But what I'd like to do is thank you, Mara, for this insight. I think I think you give us a lot to think about and pause and look at. And right now, what I think we could do is just think about, how are we looking at this? How do we see this family with all these concepts that you've given us? How do we now apply it? How does this look for us? And in looking at that family. So maybe we can all have that discussion. So maybe you start us out with that, and we'll go from here.
Yeah, so what was coming up for you both as I was talking through these trauma concepts? I know you're both familiar with them, but as you're thinking about the reality of being an FA with this family and what's coming up for each family member, what impressions or connections were you making?
I think for me, something that was coming up, if I put myself in the place of the FA who's walking into that home, I'm thinking, okay, what training do they already have? Okay, so maybe they already know that each person in this situation might internalize what's going on a little differently, will experience this trauma a little differently. And if I'm that FA, and I'm not Liz, who helped write the case study, has been thinking about these characters, all that sort of thing. I'm thinking, where do we even start as an FA? There's all these moving pieces. There's all these different ways it can be internalized. How do you even know which way is up and which way is down? So I guess for me, what's coming up is just feeling and acknowledging that sense of being just so overwhelmed, and then adding onto it whatever your own interpersonal world and triggered experience may or may not be.
Yeah, I could see that you could shut down yourself.
Oh,
Here
yeah.
you're going to walk into a home with people who are going through all of this, recognizing that there are people going through who have shut down themselves and just trying to make it through. And now you're thinking, what do I do? How do I help them? I'm feeling all of this trauma myself and just going through what you're living through. I don't know where to go. I don't know how to begin. And you could find yourself, because you now know, I've got to go back to this home time and time again to deal with this. I've got paperwork. I've got these people. I've got all their stuff to take care of. I've got my stuff. If I even recognize that I have stuff that I'm going through with them, where do I go with this? How do I help them? And how do I not shut down from them and not be any help to them at all?
Right. And how do I do that ethically as an FA? Because I know for me, so I've been formally diagnosed with PTSD. And then with my working background in high acuity residential, it's like I can be triggered all day, but I hit fight. That's where I go. But as an FA, it's not your responsibility to do a therapeutic hold on Candace and get the glass out of her hand. And, that's not your place. It's not your responsibility to, take the audience away from the situation, manage the other kids' emotions, get them with an adult who can supervise and distract, but for me, if I'm walking into that situation as an FA, that's my background. Like, I can be triggered all day. I'll process the blood I saw later. I can, disassociate from myself and just have fight response for the people around me. Mm-hmm. But what risk do you put yourself at when it comes to ethics and, the by the book written procedure? Where does that leave you when you have to go through crisis with your families? That's all something to be considered.
I think that brings up such an important tension for people, because when we aren't in our window, when we move into these survival-based responses, they're neurobiologically the part of our brain that walks us through that logical, I don't think I should do this, right? Shuts down. It goes offline. So our executive functioning, the part of us that would go, okay, that's not a good idea, can go offline, and we start really relying on instinct. Sometimes our instincts don't work within the situation, right? So that's often then we judge ourselves afterward. There's a lot of shame for like, why did I do that? That was, why didn't I call the police in the moment? Why didn't I think of that? Right? Oh, well, if I have a experience, if I'm coming into that home as someone who has experienced trauma with the police, or, maybe I identify as a Black woman and I'm like, I would never think to call the police in my moment of crisis. So that might not be my first response. And I might walk away and my supervisor might say, why did so did you call the police? No, right? Because I'm aware this family has these dynamics, they're biracial, and I'm worried about what's going to happen. I'm worried about myself, and I'm going to just rely on my instincts for what's going to help me survive, right? So there's a tension there, because sometimes what's indicated professionally isn't always what our survival brain indicates for us to do. So I'm curious from both of you, like, what do you do with that? What do you do with that when maybe your instinct isn't in line with how you're supposed to respond?
I think therein is the problem. Therein is the problem, because you feel like, oh my gosh, I can't say anything to these people over here because they don't understand. I understand because I went through that. And I know that they aren't going to, and they'll make wrong decisions for this family. So I think that is the problem. We take on all of this because I know better. And we kind of become codependent with that family in taking care of them and doing all these things. And we find ourselves being drained more and more until we feel like I've gotten to a point where I now have to finally say something. But you're torn really with that. Yeah. So I believe that could be some of the issues that I've seen, heard, and experienced in being a family advocate and here as a coach. And we aren't therapists. And so what do you do? Because they may not have, in their poverty, they may not have access to all of those resources, and may not feel like they can go to those, maybe because they have no car or whatever it is. So you feel like that's your responsibility and you become the be all, do all for them.
Right. Yeah. That codependency piece is huge because, if we bring this back to the family, I know when I was, going over kind of like the different family members and their MO and kind of the background that mom's given the FA from mom's perspective is, mom is Irish, German, American. Mom is with a white man in the house with 4 biracial babies, so maybe for mom, she's like, why couldn't I call the police? Well, because, my 6-year-old ADHD kid was just frustrating and hysterical, and I didn't want to deal with DCFS. But really what's at the root of that is, your 6-year-old knows that Black men get murdered because your 6-year-old sees it on the TV all the time. Your 6-year-old is a Black boy being raised by a white man, and it's his Black father who's the aggressor. That child still does not, regardless of the harm that a parent can do, certain ages developmentally, they're still going to feel that pull and that fear of what could happen to dad, And so, that codependency piece is just huge, because if you're an FA or you're someone interacting with this family and you're biracial, or, you identify with that specific niche and the racial oppression that yeah, the 6-year-old's feeling, but mom doesn't see, your instinct is going to pull you to different pieces of the family. You're not always going to be looking at this family holistically. If you know that mom, presents as a white woman and doesn't get why Jeremiah is in hysterics and just thinks it's his ADHD acting up, you're going to feel that pull of protecting or wanting to help advocate, right? Our FAs are going to want to advocate, and they're getting pulled in so many different ways in this case study by this family because of how many different things are going on for each person in the family.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think that there is also a huge piece of just looking at the intergenerational trauma dynamic. So it's not really a term that I identified, but we can think about, as we think about attachment trauma, and we think about the ways in which experiences get passed on, right? When a family has been unsafe, when the experience of safety and security has not been part of their lived experience, that's going to keep passing on, right? It's going to be hard to create a safe environment for the little ones if mom isn't feeling safe, if dad isn't feeling safe, if the relationship between parents isn't safe. So we have this scene where we have grandma and we have mom and we have dad, and we have each of their histories of trauma and stress, and it's affecting how they react and respond, right? It sounds like in the scene there's a lot of aggression and panic, and that's coming out as anger, right? As leaping toward Candace, not necessarily having a very calm, loving tone. And for me, I might walk into that scene and say, well, why would, that's not how I would respond as a parent. That's not how I would respond as a mother. I would try to, talk calmly and, find out what's going on. But there is this intergenerational trauma piece. And there's also this family has had all this involvement with DCFS, and an FA just walked in to this scene, right? So now mom and stepdad and grandma are thinking, oh my gosh, this is a threat to our safety. Having someone witness this, knowing what's going on, and their intergenerational experiences of safety within the system and the FA representing the system are going to impact whether or not, they can even respond effectively, because now all these pieces are in conflict. Right?
Yeah.
So you've got grandma, who I believe she's in her late 50s, maybe 60s, might have experienced, as a person, what went on at her time, maybe the 60s or 70s, maybe as maybe a woman of color, or maybe just as a woman, how things went, and if you've got a problem, shut your mouth. You don't talk to people like that. Or not being able to really, as a child or as the adult parent of these kids, express to grandma and have grandma hear you, because maybe many times grandma has a usurped parent of the child's authority as a parent. That's just how we do. You don't say anything to the police, and if don't talk back to me, kind of, that was how people handled things. Now
I'll give you a reason to cry.
Right, I'll give you a reason to cry. So now, parent, the one in the middle, the parent of the child, we don't have any other resources. We keep falling back on that, trying to be our own person, but falling back because we don't have anything else. And then we're trying to deal with all of this trauma that's just kind of squeezing the life out of us. And it's then passing all of that stress and trauma and everything down to the next generation. There's no wonder these kids aren't stopped, frozen, ready to run, or just everything's fine. Everything's fine. But inside, they're just dying inside, and nobody can see it, and nobody can stop to see it. And everybody's just in this place where they don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
They're just surviving the best they can with the little skills that they have. I can't even imagine. But we can because we've worked with this.
Right. And if you haven't, you will. And
Well,
there's no warning to it, and it's especially when it comes down generationally, maybe, Agnes and Myrtle, maybe this was not in their family dynamics at all. Maybe we saw a very typical household when Agnes was being raised. So, we have Agnes who's like, what is all this abuse? This isn't how I grew up. Why am I with men that abuse me? Now it's my kid. Like, what am I doing? Right. We have grandma who's like, are you kidding me? Like, that's the generation of, I'll give you a reason to cry. Stop crying or I'll give you a reason. So she's like, my granddaughter's cutting herself for what? There is that disconnect between generationally, how are they understanding mental health? And if the parents and the grandparents can't understand mental health, what are these kiddos in our family supposed to understand? The oldest one's 16. He's fighting grown men. They're having to figure out mental health and how they're going to manage and survive as almost a separate family unit from the larger family unit. It becomes the kids are their own unit because, grandma and mom and whatever boyfriend's here at the time, they don't know.
Yeah.
They can't even begin to understand why a child would cut themselves. They're coming from the state of mind of, you're 14. You don't even know what life is yet, and they can't wrap their head around the severity and the validity of the mental health crisis that Candace is in. And if they can't even do that, how are they going to wrap their head around the 2-year-old who can't verbalize that developmentally they're being changed by all this day in and day out?
In the middle of all of this, trying to figure out your identity, who I am in all of this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to, we have about 15 minutes left, and I want to, I think there's so much for us to talk about here. And I want to just remind everyone who's listening that we're going to be talking about this family throughout the next 5 series of conversations. So we really have a chance to dive into some of these dynamics. I know there are a lot of pieces that we didn't get to touch on or talk about in terms of just even some of the identity dynamics and some of the stereotypes that this family may be trying to navigate, and some of the ways that we as providers or advocates might need to check some of our biases as we come in. So I think we'll have time, hopefully, to get into all of that. But I wonder, maybe we can just throw it back to you, Liz, and we can move forward into a pause.
Yeah. So we do want to give time for you guys to take a pause here. And like Mara said, with the following podcasts in this series, there is going to be that deeper dive into gender, into race, into the stereotypes that these kiddos are going to feel both from society and then what they're getting from mom and within the household. So we will go back to that. But something that we really were able to get into is that aspect of how is this looking through the generations in this family? And something that's at the root of that is love. What is love in this family? What does love look like? Who's teaching the definition of love? Is love healthy to this family? How, is love safe to these kids, whether it's from parents or future relationships? So we want to leave you before the pause with this idea of what is love in this family? What does love mean? And on the guided questions resource that you have, there's this quote, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to read it to us. before you guys pause, because it's really going to help think about love in family. And it's from the book All About Love by Bell Hooks. If you haven't read it, I can't recommend it enough. So this quote is just from the prologue, and I think it's profound. So imagine the rest of the pages. So she writes, everyone assumes that we will know how to love instinctively. Despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, we still accept the family as the primary school for love. Those of us who do not learn how to love among family are expected to experience love in romantic relationships. However, this love often eludes us, and we spend a lifetime undoing the damage caused by cruelty, neglect, and all manner of lovelessness experienced in our families of origin and in relationships where we simply did not know what to do. So thinking about that, go ahead and take a pause.
So that looks interesting. And, I think about this. This is something we always say to our family advocates. You are the experts of the family. You are the ones who know the most about this family. This is your child. And we don't want to step in and take over. We want to help facilitate. Well, when your family is going through what this family is going through, how do you see love in that? So the question I have to ask you is, what does caring for this family look like? How do you get love out of this family or help them see love in this family? So.
Yeah, I think that's such a good question, Patrice. And just as we think about, I think, love as the resource that families have, and how do we help them actually find healthy expressions of love? How do we help them learn to get back into their windows so they can express love in a healthy way, and they can be in their emotions and in connection with each other? And so that is something that I really look forward to exploring as we talk about skillful ways of working with this family and rooting it in this idea that, how do we help strengthen their connection, and how do we help them learn ways of healthy ways to love each other, right? Because we think that's natural. We think naturally we know how to love one another, but when we have been stuck in survival responses our whole life, when we have experienced so much trauma within the context of what is supposed to be loving, our signals can get pretty crossed, and our ability to express love in healthy ways can really be compromised. So I think we will definitely get into that. So I want to just talk a little bit about what trauma-informed care would look like with this family, and review some of the principles of trauma-informed care that are on the handout, and that I have talked. I know I've done some talk with the team on this, so it might be familiar for some, but we're going to jump back over to the handout and just come over to that last page. There on the side there, you can review and understand the symptoms of PTSD and what that looks like. I'm not going to spend a lot of time there just because of time right now, but we will talk about that more as the series moves forward. I really want to focus here on these principles of trauma-informed care, what that would look like for this family. So the core principles of trauma-informed care here are, first, safety, right? We can immediately see that safety is compromised, right? This is just not a safe situation for anyone. And so when we're working with trauma survivors, we really have to first address that. How do we create environments that feel both physically and emotionally safe? So when I'm coming back into this home after this incident, how is that environment? How can we create safety in that environment? Right? How can we explore safety in that environment? Or maybe we need to go for a walk outside as we meet with mom, so that we can really take her out of the environment that feels so chronically stressful and where all these really traumatic things are happening, and help her reorient to the world in a safe way. That may work for one mom, and for someone else, it may feel really unsafe to walk around my neighborhood where everyone knows that we just had the police over at our house and that I'm feeling judged, right? So exploring how do we achieve both environmental and physical safety, and also how do we achieve a sense of emotional safety? How do we help people stay in their window or come back to their window as we're working with them? Because all interventions rely on the ability to be in your window and be able to process and understand information. And the ability to express and feel love relies on the ability to be in your window, right? We can't safely socially engage with others and express love and care and healthy attachment if we don't feel safe, if we're stuck in our survival responses. The first thing would be looking at how do we address the safety issues, both physically and emotionally, for each member of this family, and how do we mitigate the impact that feeling unsafe is going to have on their ability to be supported by me as an advocate, right? Part of creating that safety is some of these other principles. So trustworthiness and transparency. If I'm going to have to report that incident to DCFS, I'm not going to assume the family knows that, and I'm going to make sure that I'm really transparent with them about how that's going to happen, right? So we have a certain period of time. I think for most agencies, they're like 24 to 48 hours that you have to report it. You may not say right in that moment, hey, I have to call DCFS, but you may, call that mom up after and say, so you may realize that I need to make a report to DCFS, and I want to know how you would like that to happen. What would feel best for you? This is the process, right? This is our normal process. How would you like to be involved in that? You really want to give a sense of control back to the family, even knowing that obviously mom's probably going to say, yeah, don't do that. Don't report it, right? And you're confined by the responsibility to do that, but you can be transparent about that. This is something I have to do, but I want you to be involved, right? I respect you as a parent. I know this is an extremely overwhelming experience. And what do you think is the best way for us to move forward? Mm-hmm. Would you like to be on the phone with me as I report it? Would you like to make the report and send me a copy of that so I know it's been done? Talking through and being really transparent about that. And then the next piece in our trauma-informed care principles is you as the advocate getting support, right? Not managing this alone. Being sure, even if you walk away like Liz might, talking about your ability to just kind of like disconnect and do the thing, you might be like, I'm cool, I'm fine, right? I don't need any support. You do need support, right? To be ethical, to be able to be a good steward of trauma and to do trauma work in a trauma-informed way, you need to get support even when you think you don't need it. So you're going to reach out to your team. You're going to reach out to your coach. You're going to reach out to maybe Kevin or myself as supporters of the team and talk through this. What came up for you? What are some of your automatic responses? Are there any pieces you're feeling guilt or shame about, right? Get that support so that you can get out of your own way and not be operating outside of your window as you're trying to support the family. Then we're looking at, okay, how do we collaborate? How do we bring a team-based approach to this, right? Who else needs to be involved? And how do we bring the family members into that collaborative decision-making? So a lot of people were present. And Patrice talks about those, I think you called it circles of care or circle of
security.
Trust. Circles of security, all the things, care, trust, security. So the circles of security, how do we, yes, exactly. How do we collaborate within that circle, right? How do we make sure that I'm not over here talking to mom and saying, I really want to empower you to make this report to DCFS yourself. And then my supervisor is making the report because we haven't talked. And all of a sudden I realize, oh my gosh, we've undermined our sense of collaboration and trust because we weren't all communicating. There wasn't a team-based approach, right? And really think about how do you power share with this family, right? Because the core experience of trauma is feeling powerless, right? Feeling like I can't protect myself. So every little way that you can restore some sense of power, this kid moves into that fifth principle. How do we give them voice and choice and really focus on empowerment in every step of the way, even in a situation where there may be some power taken away from the family, honestly, because we may have to report this and there may be some things out of our control that happen. So focus on how do we restore a sense of voice and choice to each member of the family. Looking at Candace, how do we give her a voice in this? What does she want to see happen next? What kind of support does she need? I see this come up with parents a lot where it's like, most parents would say, all right, this kid needs to be in therapy, right? And as the FA, you may be like, I'm going to get this family resources. They need to go to the multicultural counseling center. We know that they can, provide some therapy for this kiddo. But Candace needs to feel like she got to choose that, right? Mm-hmm. So we have to be able to talk to her and say, what do you feel like you need right now? Clearly, you need help. You're letting us know that, right? What kind of help would be most useful? So you can help the family have that conversation, and how do you empower each member of the family to really amplify their voice and give them choices? And then lastly, you're always looking at this through cultural, historical, and sort of this intersectional lens, right? Understanding that these experiences do not happen in a vacuum, and every aspect of that family's identity is going to impact their experience, and your identities are going to impact that experience. So you're working to uproot your own internalized biases as you're working with this family, dismantle some of the systemic oppression, knowing that when you do report this to DCFS, that is a system that is embedded in these systems of oppression, right? So how do you try to create some safeguards against the ways that this family might be disproportionately impacted by making a report like that? So we're almost out of time. These principles are things that I want you to hold in mind as we move forward. But I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and just talk really quickly about a few resources. If after hearing this conversation, you immediately feel like you need some support yourself, or you're recognizing the families I'm working with need some support, we've provided some resources for you. So firstly, recognizing that there's this culture of mental health at DDIV that is part of a trauma-informed care model. So you have Kevin and myself as mental health professionals that can support you as team members. Kevin can support the families and the kiddos. The Multicultural Counseling Center, who has a contract to do therapeutic work and trauma-informed therapeutic work with these families. And then you also have your coaches, Patrice and Liz, who are here to provide that mutual aid and support as a core part of trauma-informed care. There's also a couple of hotlines to call your attention to: the suicide hotline, domestic violence hotline, and then also locally here in Salt Lake, Uni has their crisis line. You can talk to a mental health professional at any time. So make sure that you're referencing those resources on the handouts that we've given you, and that you're reaching out for help if you need it, internally or externally within DDIV or outside of DDIV, and that you're connecting your families in need of immediate crisis support. That's I think all we have today. Anything you want to, Patrice or Liz, anything you want to say to take us out?
I don't know. Did you need to say anything, Liz? Because I'm just going to thank everybody. Okay. I just want to thank you all for coming and being a part of this work that we're doing. As Mara said, we've got 5 others that we want to do. And then even in the bigger picture, there's more work that Liz and I and the family advocate leads, and even hopefully Mara and anyone else that we can pull into this work that we're doing. Thank you for being here. Please, we want to remind you to go back to the resources that we have provided you with. And as we continue on with this work, I'm sure there'll be more resources that we will add to you. And then, and these podcasts will be available to you. I don't know when, but they will be available to you. And Liz and I will let you know about that. But again, thank you. And we hope to see you again soon. And thank you, Mara. And thank you, Liz. And goodbye.